The case, informally known among European researchers as the man who saw two sides of heaven, began in 2003 in the city of Białystok, eastern Poland. Marek Zielinski, then 35 years old, was an IT technician leading a moderately active life, divided between his work, bicycle tours, and simple daily life in a residential neighborhood. The son of a traditional Catholic family, he grew up attending Sunday Mass and held clear religious beliefs, although he had never delved into more complex spiritual topics. Nothing suggested his life would take a turn that would later capture the attention of doctors, psychologists, and eventually scholars of Ian Stevenson's work, the Canadian-American psychiatrist who dedicated decades to studying memories of previous lives and consciousness border phenomena. In September of that same year, Marek was involved in a serious traffic accident on his way home from work. According to the medical report from Białystok University Hospital, he was found unconscious, with initial cardiac arrest and multiple internal injuries. Paramedics performed resuscitation for approximately 4 minutes before his pulse was restored. During this interval, Marek experienced something he would still describe years later with the same precision and lack of hesitation. In his own words, he claimed to have perceived a succession of layers, as if being transported through a space that did not obey known physical laws. The first sensation he described was a complete detachment from the body. He recognized the clinical environment, something he could only have seen from above, and identified two voices that later corresponded to those of the paramedics. However, what marked him most was not the out-of-body perspective, which is relatively common in near-death experience, NDE accounts, but what happened immediately after. Marek described being enveloped by a kind of diffuse clarity that did not recall the traditional Catholic iconography. He used to say there were neither gates nor recognizable figures, only an inviting yet impersonal presence. In his statements, especially in the first years after the accident, his effort to remain true to the experience and avoid rigid religious interpretations was evident. He emphasized that during this phase, he felt a sudden expansion of consciousness, as if simultaneously understanding that this place was not definitive. It was precisely then that a kind of intrusive memory unexpectedly emerged, a memory that did not belong to his current life. Marek reported seeing with unusual clarity a simple wooden house surrounded by a rye field and a narrow dirt road. He described the smell of damp wood and the sound of hurried footsteps outside the dwelling. The most fascinating detail, however, came when he claimed to have seen his own hands, which were much older, marked by decades of wear, with a thin wedding ring on his left ring finger. The temporal consistency of this flash did not align with the life he knew. Marek had never lived outside urban areas nor worked in agriculture. This perception, he said, occurred as complete knowledge, not as an image conjured by imagination. This brief recollection, appearing precisely in the interval between unconsciousness and the resumption of vital signs, is the point that would later spark the interest of scholars familiar with Ian Stevenson's records, particularly regarding memories arising in altered states of consciousness. When Marek regained consciousness in the intensive care unit, time felt fragmented. He only recalled flashes of medical personnel, the distant sound of instruments, and the sudden feeling of heaviness upon returning to his own body. In the first few days, he avoided talking about the episode. Doctors attributed his perceptions to the combination of cerebral hypoxia and post-resuscitation medication, but Marek knew how to clearly distinguish what had been confusion from what remained firm, almost tangible, in his memory. The memory of the wooden house, the aged ring, the smell of damp earth, all of it returned persistently, as if it had been genuinely experienced. A nurse named Jadwiga, who monitored his recovery, recalls him waking up agitated, mumbling disjointed phrases in Old Polish, inserting words in some parts that she did not recognize. He muttered something like, "Wracam, ale nie jestem ten sam," she recounted years later. Translated, "I am returning, but I am not the same." The phrase deeply resonated with Marek, who had no recollection of saying it. When he was transferred to the general ward, he received a visit from a hospital social worker who, after his initial account, suggested he seek psychological support to process the near-death experience. Yet, during the first counseling session, the phenomenon became even more salient. As he described the vision of the wooden house, Marek added a detail he had not previously mentioned. He knew with absolute conviction that this house was located somewhere in the countryside between Suwałki and the Lithuanian border, a region he had never visited. The psychologist asked how he could be so sure, and Marek simply replied, "Because I have been there before, not as Marek." The remark drew attention, not for its strangeness, but for the clarity with which it was expressed. He seemed neither confused nor emotional. He was simply affirming an internal fact, like someone recognizing a place from their childhood. This conviction sparked a growing restlessness in him, especially since nothing before the accident had indicated an interest in spiritual matters or stories about previous lives. After being discharged, Marek returned to his routine, but quickly noticed that something fundamental had shifted. Everyday details reminded him of the experience: the smell of damp wood after the rain, the sound of footsteps in narrow corridors, even the texture of certain metal objects. He began to record everything in a notebook in an attempt to organize his own mind. In the first month, he noted over 60 fragments of memory that did not belong to his current biography. A woman with her hair tied up in a light-colored scarf, a small child running down the dirt road, a table with knife marks, agricultural tools hanging on the wall. These recurring details began to form a more coherent picture than he wanted to admit. In his quiet research, he discovered that many elements belonged to the rural Polish daily life of the 1930s and 1940s, a period of intense social and religious tension, where many smaller villages saw population shifts and familial losses due to the war. What troubled him most was the sensation of not just looking back. He felt longing, and that, for the first time, drove him to seek trustworthy scientific sources. It was at this point that he came across the name Ian Stevenson, whose studies described cases strikingly similar to his, memories emerging in the context of traumatic events, accidents, or states near death. Reading about Ian Stevenson marked a turning point in Marek's journey. He found references to the researcher in specialized articles translated into Polish and later in German academic publications on consciousness studies. Stevenson had dedicated decades to the investigation of spontaneous memories of previous lives, especially those reported by children. However, some of his less-known studies featured cases where recollections arose after physical trauma or critical states of consciousness, circumstances very close to Marek's NDE. What impressed him most was Stevenson's insistence on rigorous methodology: interviews, documentary verification, analysis of historical correspondence. Nothing resembled sensationalist literature. It was science, even if it dealt with little explored frontiers. Encouraged by this approach, Marek decided to reconstruct the fragmented memories using similar criteria. He started a second notebook, dividing it into 3 categories: sensory descriptions, place memory, and emotional impressions. As he organized, he noticed a pattern solidifying. Several memories pointed to a rural area between Suwałki and Szczecin, precisely near the region he had spontaneously mentioned during psychotherapy. The landscape of northeastern Poland, with its rye fields and traditional wooden houses, called Drunian Chati, perfectly matched the scenery he had seen during the NDE. One winter afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table, Marek wrote a phrase he later found unsettling: "I recognize a life I haven't lived." He claimed to have felt a wave of familiarity mixed with a kind of nostalgia upon writing it. Although he tried to maintain rational distance, as Stevenson's methods suggested, the experience was too intimate to be treated as merely clinical data. Over the weeks, an emotional element came to the forefront: the figure of the woman with the light-colored scarf. In different fragments, Marek described her smile, the way she adjusted the scarf at the nape of her neck, and an expression of concern that always appeared when he, or whoever he was in that memory, walked away down the dirt road. Although she had no name, she recurred as if she were a real person, part of a biography that had remained hidden until the moment of clinical death. When discussing the matter with his cousin Tomasz, Marek heard a warning: "You're getting carried away." This is just the psyche after the trauma. The criticism briefly shook him, but did not stop him. The feeling of recognition was too intense to ignore. With each memory flash, he grew more convinced that he had to objectively verify at least one of the recurring images, be it geographically, historically, or even architecturally. The possibility of experiencing a phenomenon similar to the cases described by Stevenson stirred an unexpected sense of responsibility in him. He did not seek to prove anything to anyone, but he needed to prove to himself that he was not confusing imagination with authentic memories. So, he decided to do something simple and concrete: identify, in real life, a wooden house with the precise characteristics he had seen during his NDE. This decision led him to plan his first trip since the accident in March 2004. He chose the Suwałki region as the most coherent point with the memories, drawing on the map possible rural routes that matched the narrow roads he repeatedly saw in his mind. He told no one. He simply packed the notebook in his backpack and left at dawn. The drive to Suwałki was in almost ritual silence. Marek drove along secondary roads, leaving the urban centers behind, immersing himself in the rural landscape of northeastern Poland. The land, at the beginning of spring, still carried the late chill of the region. The first rye plants appeared as shy green patches, and the humid air brought the smell of freshly turned earth, a scent that evoked an unsettling feeling of familiarity in him. He noted in his book, "The smell is the same." Arriving in the small village of Jeleniewo, he parked in front of a local general store. He ordered a coffee and observed the locals speaking regional dialects, some wearing typical work attire. Although nothing was immediately recognizable, there was an atmosphere that seemed to align with the flashes of his NDE. After a few minutes, Marek asked the owner if there were still old wooden houses in the area, ones built before World War II. She affirmed, especially on small properties tucked away from the main road. Armed with a simple map, he began to drive along the rural paths, long strips of compacted earth lined by fields stretching as far as the eye could see. At every turn, he carefully observed every wooden structure, every abandoned barn, every uneven fence. At a certain point, driving down a narrow road, he noticed the dense silence around him, interrupted only by the distant sound of footsteps on dry branches. The sound instantly gave him goosebumps. It was the exact same sound that recurred in his memories. Just a few meters ahead, a house appeared that made him stop abruptly. It was simple, with wood darkened by time, small windows, and a slightly protruding awning over the entrance. Marek felt his body tremble. The structure was an almost perfect match for the image he had seen during his NDE. The angle of the roof, the wear of the boards, the position of the window on the left. He got out of the car with shaky legs, approaching slowly, as if afraid the vision might dissolve. When he touched the wood, he felt the same rough texture he had repeatedly described. An older man emerged from the side door, surprised by the visit. Marek explained he was conducting a study on old buildings in the region and asked when the house had been built. The gentleman replied that it dated back to 1932, built by his grandfather, and had remained almost unchanged since. This detail unnerved him. It was the precise time frame that corresponded to the memories emerging in his flashes. With permission, Marek walked around the house, carefully observing every corner. At one point, he stopped in front of the side window, sensing that something was fitting internally, like a piece finally finding its place. He noted, "I recognize this place, but I shouldn't." Looking out at the field before him, he saw for a moment the silhouette of the woman with the light-colored scarf, not as a physical vision, but as an emotion, so strong it seemed palpable. The longing returned abruptly. Before leaving, he asked the resident if a large family had lived in the house. The older man confirmed that a couple with 2 children had lived there before the war. The husband had died in the 1940s under unclear circumstances. "No one knows exactly what happened," he said. He left one morning and never returned. This narrative hit Marek hard. It was precisely the feeling of the dirt road, leaving and not coming back. Returning to Białystok, Marek carried a restlessness that was difficult to articulate. The trip had not provided definitive answers, but it had given concrete form to the fragmented memories that surfaced during the near-death experience. The concordance between the real house and the vision recorded at the hospital exceeded what he considered coincidence. Yet, he tried to maintain the methodological discipline inspired by Ian Stevenson's studies. Record, compare, verify. No hasty conclusions. Days later, he reviewed his notebooks. There were highly specific sensory descriptions: the smell of old wood, the sound of external footsteps, the texture of a worn plank floor. Everything matched what he had found in the village of Jeleniewo. More disturbing, however, was rereading the passages about daily domestic life, especially the constant presence of the woman with the light-colored scarf. He wrote, "I feel like she waited for someone who didn't return." During a psychological follow-up session, he reported the impact of visiting the house. The psychologist listened carefully, asking if he thought he might be constructing a narrative to give meaning to the trauma of the NDE. Marek responded that he considered that hypothesis, but insisted that the feeling of recognition was of a different order, something that transcended imagination. "It's like remembering something that really happened, but outside of my life," he explained. The psychologist suggested he research historical records of the region, perhaps to better understand the possible origin of the fragments. Following this advice, Marek consulted municipal archives and old parish registers, many of which were kept in small churches in the region. Examining documents from the 1930s and 1940s, he found references to several families who had lived in the nearby villages. One record caught his attention. A man named Jan Kulesza, born in 1902, married to a woman named Katarzyna, mother of 2 children. The last mention of Jan was in 1943, followed by a brief note, "Missing." The disappearance matched the description given by the older resident. Although Marek knew he could not establish a direct connection without solid proof, an involuntary impulse struck him when reading the name Katarzyna. He wrote in his notebook, "The light scarf could be hers." It was not proof, but the emotional association seemed to carry an internal coherence. In the following days, Marek immersed himself in Stevenson's classic reports. In several cases, studied between the 1960s and 1990s, children described previous lives with geographical and emotional detail, often linked to sudden or unexpected deaths. The pattern was notable: intense memories, connected to affection, the domestic environment, and often a feeling of incompleteness. He noted that his own case, although experienced in adulthood, followed a similar logic: an abrupt death, a possible unfinished family, and a memory emerging precisely at the boundary between life and death. A phrase Stevenson had noted in one of his studies deeply resonated with him. Some individuals appear to carry fragments of interrupted stories. Marek began to read this sentence daily, as if seeking in it not just scientific understanding, but also comfort. If his NDE showed him a heaven that was different from the imagined one, it also seemed to have opened the door to a past that was not his, yet claimed him. Over the months, Marek noticed his life had entered a kind of dual course. On one side, the usual routine of work, weekly shopping, and brief chats with neighbors. On the other, a silent process of historical and emotional reconstruction. The near-death experience was no longer just an extraordinary event, but became a lens through which he reinterpreted his own existence. The rigid separation between the spiritual and the mundane was gone. Now, everything seemed connected by a deeper logic. The decisive moment occurred in July 2004, when Marek returned to the Suwałki region, calmer this time. He was not looking for new discoveries, but rather to observe the surroundings without the pressure of the first visit. He walked slowly along the dirt roads, feeling the cold wind from the north. Passing by the 1932 house again, he encountered the same elderly resident sitting on the porch. They spoke of trivial details, weather, crops, village renovations, and unconsciously, Marek let slip that he felt he had known the place since before he was born. The man looked at him, puzzled but not suspicious. He merely remarked that many stories of the region had been lost during the war, and that sometimes people claimed to recognize places without ever having visited them. "Human memory stores more than we think," he said simply. Marek thanked him and went to the road, where he stood for long minutes, gazing at the tree line. The feeling of déjà vu still pulsed, but gentler, like a memory that accepts being remembered without demanding an explanation. Back in the urban Poland of the 21st century, Marek decided to systematize the entire experience. He wrote a complete report combining his NDE recollections, the fragments of the possible previous life, and the historical verifications in the regional archives. He sent this dossier to a small group of European researchers familiar with Ian Stevenson's legacy. He sought neither fame nor public confirmation. He simply wanted someone with rigorous training to analyze his case without prejudice. Months later, he received a reply from a German researcher specializing in comparative studies of anomalous memories. She praised the precision of the records, highlighting that the case presented characteristic elements observed in Stevenson's research: memories linked to sudden death, a strong emotional component, and a verifiable geographical connection. Nevertheless, she also emphasized the impossibility of definitive conclusions. In her letter, she wrote, "The value of this type of case is not to prove a thesis, but to expand the field of observation about the limits of human consciousness." Marek kept the letter like someone guarding an intimate confirmation. Not that he had lived another life, but that his experience deserved to be taken seriously. With time, the anxiety that had accompanied him since the accident transformed into something more serene. The image of the woman with the light-colored scarf no longer appeared as a cry, but resided in his memory as part of a possible story. He did not know if he had been Jan Kulesza, nor did he intend to assume that identity. What he knew with absolute clarity was that, during the minutes he was clinically dead, he had reached a layer of consciousness that challenged his childhood religious beliefs. A heaven that was different from the imagined one, as he described from the beginning, was not based on dogma or sacred figures, but on the deep perception of continuity, that life, in some way, is not abruptly cut off, but merely transforms. This understanding would accompany him for the rest of his life. Marek did not become a preacher or a mystic. He remained a Polish IT technician living his ordinary life. But in silence, he carried the burden and the tenderness of two interwoven stories within him. And so ended his testimony, a man who, in surviving the threshold of death, did not find absolute answers, but an expanded narrative of what existence means.